Hi, greetings and welcome to today's program entitled Ants, the Number One Pest in Schools. This webinar is produced by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Center of Expertise for School IPM. The views expressed by our presenters are for educational purposes only and do not represent the official views or positions of the EPA or the presenters' organizations. This webinar is part of a series of educational school IPM presentations intended to educate stakeholders such as yourselves and others in school and school-related positions about the importance of school integrated pest management, or IPM, to student health and steps to accomplish an effective school IPM program. This is Dr. Marcia Anderson with the Center of Expertise for School IPM located in Dallas, Texas. I have the great pleasure of being your moderator during today's program. First, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today's webinar. Every school has a pest walk, fly, or hitchhike in at one time or another, and today's webinar will discuss how to look for and manage ants, and in many instances, how you can prevent them to come even before they enter your school. Okay, if pests such as ants can be prevented from entering your building in the first place, you'll not have to deal with them later on. So our focus today will be on excluding and controlling ant pests from our schools using an integrated pest management approach. So before we introduce our great presenters, I'd like to take a few minutes to review integrated pest management and why it's important. Protecting the health of children is a top priority for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Children face increased risks to their health when they're exposed to pests and pesticides. And for this reason, the U.S. EPA recommends that all school districts and independent school campuses implement programs that promote both the safe use of pesticides and administering integrated pest management programs. IPM encourages both long-term and sustainable approaches to successful pest management. By developing a coordinated IPM program, school leaders demonstrate their commitment to promoting a healthy environment where students can be more productive. Effective pesticide safety and IPM programs address not only the safety concerns of using pesticides, but also focus on solution-based approaches that solve the reason why pests are in our schools in the first place. This is a proactive rather than a reactive approach that focuses on pest prevention rather than pest control. And as a result, it provides a sustainable and long-term pest management alternative to traditional pesticide-centric methods. The public is increasingly concerned about environmental health risks that children can be exposed to in our nation's schools, as youth spend a significant portion of their lives in and around schools. A great portion of our school facilities have environmental conditions that may pose increased risk to children's health, including exposure to pests, pest remains, or pesticides. Reducing children's exposure to such environmental hazards improves their health, their attendance, and leads to greater academic achievement. Healthier school environments enable children to learn and produce more in the classroom, enabling them to experience a more productive and higher quality of life. Full implementation of integrated pest management reduces exposure to pests and pesticides, reduces pesticide use, reduces pest complaints, and is cost-effective. IPM is a sustainable approach to managing pests since it combines biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risks. IPM provides an opportunity to create a safer and healthier learning environment by helping to manage pests and reducing children's exposure to pesticides. It has also been shown that a good IPM program can improve indoor air quality and reduce asthma triggers, thus improving school attendance. An effective school IPM program uses common sense strategies to reduce sources of food, water, and shelter for pests in school buildings and on school grounds. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM for short, is a smarter and usually less costly option for effective pest management in any school or in any community. IPM programs take advantage of all pest management strategies, including monitoring, exclusion, sanitation, maintenance, physical and mechanical controls, and the judicious use of pesticides. Here's the IPM pyramid. Note that the biggest part of the IPM pyramid is education and communication. All the people in and around a school can do things that can help prevent or reduce pests. Cultural and sanitation practices include keeping your building and grounds clean and free of the debris that attract pests, especially dumpster, recycling areas, and storage closets. Some examples of physical and mechanical controls include keeping all possible entry points sealed up, such as gaps under doors, around pipe and wire entry points, or other foundation or roof gaps. There is typically less need for pesticides in an IPM program because doing the practices in the bottom tiers of the IPM pyramid mean that you'll have less pests with which to contend. Now, IPM does require an initial investment in things like sealing up access locations, reducing pest access to refuse or food sources, monitoring for signs of pest activity, and staff training. Once schools are trained, they learn how to spot pests in pest-conducive conditions while going about their everyday tasks. So, do what you're already doing and just think pest. So to wrap up, what are the benefits of school IPM? IPM's smart because it reduces the root cause of pest problems. It's sensible because it creates safer and healthier learning environment by managing pests and reducing unnecessary exposure to pesticides. IPM is sustainable because it provides long-term control of pests by reducing their sources of food, water, and shelter in and around schools. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished presenters. First is Dr. Dawn Gouge. Dr. Gouge is an associate professor and associate specialist, an urban entomologist with the University of Arizona. She's been an entomologist and integrated pest management specialist since 1995. Dr. Gouge's extension efforts include IPM implementation programs in public schools and public disabled and elderly housing. Her translational research studies focus on pest ecology and reduced hazard management of public health pests, including venomous arthropods, disease vectors, and bed bugs. She received her PhD from the University of Reading. Dawn serves on many committees and boards nationwide and has numerous accolades for all of her work in IPM. Dawn will introduce IPM for ants, common ant pests, and their control. Next we'll have Lawrence Bud Graham. Dr. Graham is a research fellow and extension specialist in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology at Auburn University. He's worked as an extension agent with the Alabama Cooperative Extension System and has been a research assistant at Auburn University while completing his PhD. He has been involved with IPM since his college days working with cotton. He serves as a co-chair of the Southern School IPM Work Group, co-leader of the Extension Urban IPM website, served as Alabama Pesticide Education Safety Coordinator for 8 years, along with many other boards and committees. Bud will discuss management of fire ants that plague southern schools. Dr. Daniel Suter is a professor of urban pest management at the University of Georgia. His duties include the development of extension, research, and education programs on the management of structure and household pests in support of the pest control industry, homeowners, and the Georgia Cooperative Extension Service. He coordinates the training activities of the Georgia Structural Pest Control Training Center. He received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the University of Florida. He's been at the University of Georgia since 2000. Dr. Suter holds many prestigious awards and accolades and is a member of numerous boards across the nation. Dan will show us how to identify and control carpenter ants. Mr. Fred Remulus has 35 years of experience in facilities management, 20 of which are in the kindergarten through 12 public school environment. Mr. Remulus is currently the Director of Operations at the Upper Merion Area School District in Pennsylvania, where all 6 of its operating school buildings have earned the Energy Star rating. Fred holds a BS in Civil Engineering from the University of South Carolina and an MBA from Queen's University. Under the guidance of Fred, the Upper Merion Area School District has achieved many awards and recognitions. Fred will discuss his district's ant challenges and their IPM practices. So, now without further ado, Dr. Goosh, please take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I should start by saying that I am less of an ant control expert and more of an ant enthusiast at heart. So please bear that in mind as we progress through our webinar, or at least my section. So yes, ants, they bite, they sting, and sometimes they do both at the same time. And likely this is the main reason why we're talking about ants today, but even those that don't bite or sting can certainly be significant pests in schools. So I'd like to talk a little bit about ant biology so that you'd better understand why ants can be such formidable pests. And I also want to give you an opportunity to appreciate, as I do, just how extraordinarily amazing ants actually are. Ants have been around for more than 165 million years. And in fact, modern ants that look much the same as the ants you see today have been crawling around for over 120 million years. So you can imagine when something's been around for that long, it's a pretty successful creature. Basically, once flowering plants became widespread around the globe, so did ants. Identification of ant species is one of the first steps in any integrated pest management approach, and with more than 700 ant species in the U.S., identification can be a real challenge. Ants are social insects and form highly organized societies. They're capable of truly astonishing communication and organization between individuals. Their communication is mediated in a number of different ways, using pheromones and other chemicals, as well as physical cues like honeybees, a relative of ants. Ants go through complete metamorphosis, and the males function entirely as reproductive drones, all other ants being female and, to the great extent, sterile females. They are highly ecologically significant groups of insects, and most are profoundly environmentally beneficial. So please bear that in mind as you're deciding whether something really needs to be managed or controlled or not. Fantastic 20%. You may have heard this statistic before. About 20% of the global biomass is ants. That's just a phenomenal statistic right there. That's a lot of ants. And you might think that most of them are in your schools right now, but I can guarantee they're not. But ants are not just abundant and diverse. They differ greatly in their habits. Ants are present in almost every terrestrial ecosystem, with the greatest diversity found around tropical regions. There's huge differences in their diet, their nesting preferences, and their behavior. And I listed some amazing ant behaviors on this slide, and I wanted to introduce them because not everybody's aware of just some of these incredible things they do. There are slave-raiding ants who steal the larvae of other ant species, take them back to their nests, and raise them as slaves to forage for food for them and raise their young. There are vampirism or Dracula ants who feed off the blood of their own larvae, not usually to the point where they actually kill them, but just are able to live off them. There are ants that cultivate fungal gardens to supplement their nutritional needs. There are suicidal ants who literally contract their bodies so violently that they explode, covering invaders of all kinds with an irritating goo in order to defend their colony. There are blockading ants that have specialized heads that are used to actually blockade entrance points to colonies, preventing invaders from getting inside. There are raft-forming ants, and fire ants are one of commonly known that we have in the U.S., who will survive flood events by cooperatively forming rafts of ants. And of course, the ants on the bottom of the raft all die, but those on top are able to survive. There are herding ants who carefully tend plant-feeding bugs, which produce honeydew, which they take as a food source. Some species of ants form incredibly extensive nests, some forming super colonies. Argentine ants are known to form millions of cooperating nests with billions of workers covering many, many miles. And lastly, one of my favorites, there are honeypotting ants that have specialized workers that are used to store food. Now, it's a bit of a grim day when food becomes a scarcity and those honeypot ants start being drawn upon to regurgitate what's being stored inside their own bodies, but it's a great survival mechanism. Because of the great differences in behavior, you can imagine that effective management strategies differ enormously between different ant species. So it's really important to establish what kind of ant you're dealing with before you attempt to control it. And you'll hear me say this again, but you can make the situation far worse by attempting to control a situation before you know what kind of ant it is. The first step to be certain you do actually have an ant is to determine whether you are dealing with an ant or a termite or an ant-like creature. Whether they're winged or wingless, all ants have elbowed antennae and a constricted waist. So those are the two features that are going to give you the most help. Okay, so let's assume you know you have an ant and you're trying to determine which species. It's necessary to actually know which species, not just a group of ants, not only to manage them successfully, but also to determine if they can sting, because not all ants do. We do have some medically important ant species in the U.S. These include fire ants and harvester ants because of the venomous stings they can inflict. There are also ants like pharaoh ants that can transfer pathogens, notorious in hospitals and homes and food service facilities for doing that. To use identification keys successfully, it's important to be familiar with the very basic ant anatomy. Ants have 3 body sections: the head, the thorax, and the gaster. The thorax and gaster are separated by the petiole, which is the constricted waist part that we talked about a little minute ago. And this can be formed by 1 or 2 bumps called nodes. All stinging ants have 2 nodes, but nodes may be really difficult to distinguish. Sometimes one is almost hidden. And not all 2-noded ants are capable of stinging, so that's important to bear in mind. Ant identification requires specialized keys and quite normally access to a microscope. Some common species are pretty straightforward once you're familiar with the species and their behavior and where they're likely to be and how they behave. But many are really not obvious at all and really do require you to take samples take them back inside and at least look with a hand lens. Personally, I need a microscope. If a pest management professional is treating for ants, ask what kind of ant it is, and answers like red ants, black ants, sugar ants are really not acceptable because it really doesn't give you enough information about that ant. You need a species name, ideally. So new colonies of ants begin in a few different ways. They can begin with mated flights, where a new queen leaves an old colony, mates with a male, finds a suitable site to create a new nest. She'll drop her wings and excavate a nest where she starts laying eggs. She then cares for her young and rears them, and she may never leave the nest ever again. That subsequent generations, she relies upon the workers to groom her and feed the colony. An example of that would be odorous house ants. Or new colonies may begin through a process called budding. Species like Argentine and Pharaoh ant queens can mate in an existing nest, and workers accompany the new queens to a new nest site. Queens may not even have wings or be relatively poor flyers in that case. Workers can also establish a new colony with or without mature queens through budding. In this case, workers literally carry off eggs and larvae and pupae to a new nest site and rear the immature to become reproductive males and females at the new location. Many pest species, including Argentine and Pharaoh and carpenter ants, have multiple queens within colonies, while others, like pavement ants, only have one functional queen. After one season or a few years, depending on the ant species, a colony begins to produce reproductives that leave the colony, often in swarms, to form new colonies elsewhere. And sadly, only a few of the thousands of queens produced are successful in founding new colonies. Queens are usually relatively large in size, and even though they may have dropped their wings, you can actually still see the visible wing scars where they were once attached to the thorax. They also wear little crowns, which are three little spots on their heads. Queens can live decades, possibly indefinitely in some cases, and can produce eggs at a phenomenal rate. Some species literally hundreds to thousands under optimal conditions every day. So this is the particular individual that you will want to target if you're going to control the colony. An ant colony functions as a collective, and that includes sharing tasks such as foraging, digestion even, and excretion. Talking in really general terms, food is brought to the colony by foraging ants. It is regurgitated and shared among all the ants in the colony, and that's super important. Nutritional needs differ, and the larvae are capable of communicating their needs to foraging ants, and they will actually go out and adapt their food collection accordingly. At different points, foragers will seek protein, fats, or sugars, depending on the colony needs. So it's much the same as your kids saying, I want salad for dinner. At least that's what I want to hear my kids say, although that doesn't actually happen very often. This is an important consideration when using bait products to kill colonies, because they're going to go for the particular bait that contains the nutrition that's needed by their larvae. When ants feed on liquid food, it goes into an organ inside the gaster called the crop. We commonly refer to the social stomach of an ant colony. As food collected is given to other ants through the process of regurgitation. And the actual act of passing food from mouth to mouth is called trophallaxis. And this is a term that's referred to in ant management all the time. So really important one to know. Trophallaxis, that mouth-to-mouth contact and passing of food from ant to ant. Some food is passed into the ant's own midgut where it's digested, and the rest is passed along. It's the passing around of food that results in pesticidal bait transfer and the mass killing of pest ants within a colony. Ant pupae may be naked or encased in a cocoon. A few ant species can do both, and it's thought to afford the pupae some protection from pathogens that could kill them. And adult ants keep the nest clean and obsessively groom eggs and larvae and pupae, removing all debris and microbes from them constantly. Some species of ants even disinfect their baby brood ants with an antifungal chemical produced by specialized glands. An example of this would be leaf-cutting ants that emit an antimicrobial secretion from a gland in their rear ends. When infection can't be avoided, and it happens, adult ants may take a more radical approach and physically remove sick ants from the colony altogether. Ants have significant effects on their local ecosystem, affecting both the density and the diversity of other species around them. And not surprisingly, even animals far higher on the food chain are affected. Ants move soil by nest building and improve nutrient levels in the soil by collecting food and moving it down through the soil profile. They prey on a wide range of other ants, including much larger prey, which they can tackle because of the sheer numbers of ants involved. Ant interactions with other organisms are highly diverse, and I want to give you just a couple of examples of this. Azteca ants protect the Cordia nodosa trees, which are also called ant trees. Sometimes these are South American trees, and the Azteca ants protect them from foliage-feeding insects. And the plants actually produce protective swellings in their branches where the ants live. So they have a symbiotic relationship with the trees. The plants actually develop larger structures to encourage the ants to colonize them when the plant is being fed on heavily by herbivorous insects and other creatures. Formicine ants and many other types of ants. An example would be of a different ant from a different group would be white-footed ant. They tend aphids and other honeydew-producing insects, protecting them, and even stroking them with their antennae to encourage the production of honeydew, which is a sugary solution that they poop out and the ants collect and use as a food resource. Some ants actually produce chemicals on their feet that tranquilize and subdue colonies of aphids, making them easier to manage and less likely to produce their alert and kind of panic pheromones that they use to communicate. As well as having close symbiotic relationships with plants, some species, like harvester ants, are seed predators as well as seed dispersers, so they actually feed on the seeds as well as move them around. Collecting ants can be a little tricky. Ants are delicate, and in order to identify them, quite often you have to take them back where you can look at them under a microscope. So plan to have some little vials. If you don't have alcohol in your vials, then put them in sealable containers that can be placed on ice or in a freezer, because ants can get rather stressed out and damage each other if they get the chance. It's good to keep in mind that of the more than 700 ant species in the U.S., fewer than 30 are really considered common pests, and most actually cannot stink. Determining which ant you have will tell you what their food preferences are likely to be, where they're likely to be nesting, if they do actually pose a risk if they are tramp ants or stationary ants or nomadic ants, and that's all going to affect how your pest management approach towards them. Tramp ants, like Argentine ants and Pharaoh ants and odorous house ants, are quick to move. If their colony is disturbed, they'll just up and move away. Stationary ants, like harvester ants, take a lot more disturbance before they're willing to move, but they certainly can if they have to. And then there are army ants, and there are subgenera that exist in the southern states that are extremely nomadic, just entirely nomadic, and march around all of the time. Ant management utilizes the usual array of IPM tools and activities, starting with inspecting for conducive conditions and entry points, as Marsha referenced earlier. Monitoring for their presence, identification is key, and the use of cultural, biological, and chemical control options. The best way, and I'm going to talk in really general terms, the best way to treat is at the colony nest site. Spraying individual ants is generally not effective, but cleaning up the pheromone trails can be useful, and in some instances it's necessary. If you have fire ants tromping through a classroom, vacuuming up those ants is going to be, and cleaning up that pheromone trail is going to be necessary. If you do nothing but one thing, and that one thing being, of course, what are they after? What are they foraging on? So you find a line of foraging ants, and they've found a food supply, and you vacuum up or clean up the food supply. The ants that are trailing towards the food resource have been communicating and laying down the pheromone that indicates to the other ants, there's food at the end of this road. There's food at the end of this road, and so more ants trail. If the food's removed, those trailing ants will actually go back down that trail and lay other chemicals which relay the opposite information. There's nothing here. There's nothing here. But quite often it can take a while longer than most people can tolerate for that process to occur. So cleaning up that pheromone trail is beneficial. Ultimately, the big battle is between two individuals. It's between you and the queen ant. So given that ants are quite a diverse group with drastically differing habits and lifestyles, you can imagine that ant IPM is quite a complex undertaking, and it certainly can be, but luckily we know a lot about it, and we have some great tools and strategies. So as a result, there's a wide variety of preventive actions, management tools, and pesticidal baits, many of which are species specific. You can actually make an ant problem worse by taking the wrong approach. A good example of this is when residents spray a contact pesticide for Argentine ants, which remember are tramp ants, so they will actually disperse quite dramatically when they're irritated, just making the problem more difficult to get under control. So at this point, I'll stop telling you how astonishing ants are and turn it over to two gentlemen who can actually tell you how to kill them. Thank you.
Dawn, thank you for your insightful guidance on ant IPM and very interesting ant basics, their characteristics. Next up is Dr. Lawrence Fudd Graham, who will review strategies for fire ants. Fudd, please take it away.
Okay, glad to. Imported fire ants are a problem, not only because of their painful sting that Dawn mentioned, but there is a small portion of the population that are highly allergic to these stings. These are more of a southern pest. This shows the range map of the imported fire ant in the United States. And there are some of our native ants still left in some of these areas. I know Dawn has some in Arizona. There's still some left in Texas. And the management strategies for the natives are essentially the same as they are for the imported fire ant. And like all pests, the first thing you need to know for is the biology of that insect, is how to manage it. And that's what I found out is in dealing with most people is that they don't use baits because they don't understand basically fire ant biology and how these baits work. The colony is established by mating flights of alates or the winged forms. These emerge from a mature mound, fly up about 24 to 48 hours after a rain. And once mated, this newly mated queen drops back down to the ground and removes her wings. Fortunately for us, this is the most vulnerable time in an ant's life. She's vulnerable to the environment. If it's very hot, she could die on the ground. They're vulnerable to poor judgment. I've seen pool filters filled with fire ants. And they are vulnerable to predators, and one of the major predators being other imported fire ants in areas where we have monogyne or single queen colonies. And that's pretty much most of the southern portion of the United States, except for some fairly large areas in Texas. The colony is founded by this new single female, and she'll begin to lay 10 to 20 eggs a day, and these are going to hatch in about 6 to 10 days. She'll tend these eggs, and after about 1 month, these workers will emerge as adults. They'll begin to open up the mound. They'll begin foraging to bring food back to the queen. They'll begin construction, and now this queen is going to be producing about several hundred eggs a day. For the first 3 months, this mound may not be visible, and that will be important later on when we discuss baiting. Also, these mounds can disappear during a drought and if it's disturbed, and they may not rebuild these mounds until there's new moisture. So if you're going out and you're trying to scout for fire ants and look for them on the property, it's difficult to find them, especially in the hot summer. And that's why we see in the South new mounds appearing, just popping up in your yard after a rain. But the problem that we've seen is these mounds were already there. A mound, let's see, did I skip one here? Nope, we're there. The mound is below ground, and a mature ant colony can have around 300 feet of underground tunnels. And these mounds actually act as solariums, and in the cooler weather, they'll collect heat to warm up the ground for the ants so that they will keep their brood and their queen warm up at the top of the mound. The workers in fire ant mounds are range in size. They're what we call polymorphic, and they have specific duties, and these duties are going to depend on what the colony needs are. Some of them serve as nurses caring for the brood and for the queen. Some serve as what we call reserves. They tend the mound, and these are the ones that if you step in the mound will end up stinging you most of the time. And the remainder are foragers going out and looking for food. Again, like Dawn said, they have complete metamorphosis, and if you disturb a fire ant mound, people usually see the white stuff that they see in the mound. A lot of people think these are eggs, but most of the time these are the larvae and the pupae that the ant workers are trying to save and carry off. The smaller workers in a mound can live 60 to 90 days. The large workers, 90 to 150 days. And as Dawn said, the queens can live quite a long time, up to 7 years in a fire ant mound. When they do eat, fire ants go out and gather food, and, like Dawn said, and use trophallaxis to bring back the food back to the mound. And the one thing to remember about fire ants is there's only one stage of development in the fire ant that can eat solid food, and that is the fourth instar larvae. The rest of the stages, the adult workers, the queen, and the smaller larvae can only eat liquid food. So this fourth instar larvae basically acts as a stomach of the mound for the larger solid food particles. So when the ants go out to grab food, this liquid food is transferred back to the colony, and the liquid food is fed to everyone in the colony. It's fed to the queen, it's fed to the to the larvae of all stages, first, second, and third instar. But when the fire ants go out to gather, let me get to the right place here. Solid food, which you see with the red arrow here. They bring it back to the colony, and it goes directly to the fourth instar larvae. The fourth instar larvae then digests this solid food, converts it into a liquid, and it is fed only to the queen and to the younger larvae that are in the mound. And this is where most of the proteins, the fats, the amino acids, and the lipids come back into the colony. Now, as Marcia mentioned earlier, with fire ants, we like to use what we call proactive management rather than reactive management. When I normally get my calls, this is the point that I'm at. Marcia, could someone center this thing for me where I can get started again? I can't get it in the middle there. Let's see if we get it here. It's going to stay off. But anyway, we're looking at someone that's been in their backyard sunbathing, and then the neighbors called. This is the time when the ants have become unbearable for the homeowner or for the schoolyard, and that's when I normally get my call. And it's rare that I get calls about fire ants from someone that has had a proactive approach to fire ant management. It's always reactive when we get there. We like to use an integrated pest management approach to ants, but with fire ants, unlike other insects in schools, we recommend making an application in schoolyards at least once and maybe twice a year, depending on the ant pressure that you have. And this is because those winged alerts are going to reinfest the schoolyard no matter what we do. But what we found is that our management is site-specific, depending on what part of the schoolyard it is in and what kind of traffic you have. We found that no single strategy is best for all situations. And it's better to treat our fire ants after the spring mating flights have occurred, and we like to focus on gradual rather than fast removal. And the best way to do this is by using slow-active baits that can give longer-lasting control. There are two ways to approach fire ant management. One is fast-acting residual contact insecticides. We don't recommend these much, but occasionally we do have to resort to them. They do target the foragers. They limit the contact to the colony and queen. The residual activity is going to depend on whatever rates you use, and they can be a granular or a liquid form. However, with baits, we like to use them mainly because they target the colony and queen. They take longer to kill the colony, however, but we do have a bioresidual effect with the baits, which actually shows us that slow-acting baits tend to give us longer control of the fire ants. So we like to use them. So if we're going to use fast-acting contact insecticides, we sometimes use them for mound treatments where we have mounds that are in sensitive areas, such as along sidewalks, near parking lots where people are coming into the schoolyards and where they might run into a mound and get stung and where we need to take them out in a hurry. These products are generally fast, they're easy to use, and they minimize residues using individual colony treatments. But again, remember a while ago I mentioned that mounds can be hidden, so if you try to attack a large number of mounds this way, you're going to miss some. Those invisible colonies are hard to find. You need access to the entire mound, so if it's underneath the sidewalk, it's difficult to get the product down into there, and you have to haul and mix liquids. And these approaches are not as effective in hot weather. Now, this is a diagram of a fire ant mound, and this mound can go over 5 feet into the ground, and the tunnels can go down to the water level. Fire ants exist in the mound through can exit the mound, through lateral tunnels, and they never really exit through the top of the mound. During the summer months, the sun heats up the mound and the ground around the mound to temperatures that can actually kill fire ants, and this will be important in a minute when we talk about applying fire ant baits. So what happens at this point in time is that the workers are going to be down deep in the ground where it's cooler. And so an individual mound treatment during the summer is not going to be very effective because the 1 or 2 gallons of product that you have to put in does not get down to the area where the queen and the brood are located, and they will exit through the foraging tunnels. If you have to use this approach, the best time is during the cooler winter months when that mound acts as a solarium and they bring the queen and the brood up, have them close to the surface, and if you apply an individual mound treatment at this time, they can be very effective. There are also times when you might need to do a broadcast treatment. But this is rare. This, again, is when someone has not been proactive in the approach and you have something like a sports field or an area where the children in the schoolyard play that has a heavy fire ant infestation and they need to be taken out in a hurry. You can use a broadcast application. This does slow the reinfestation for a month or so, depending on what rate you use, and gives you fairly rapid colony control. But the disadvantages that we see of this is if you don't get complete coverage of the area, you don't get good control. These products may need to be watered in, and the big thing that we don't like about using these products is that they do leave residues in sensitive areas where the children will play. What we like to use for attacking fire ants is a fire ant baiting system. The advantages of this is that the baits use the natural behavior of the fire ants to distribute the toxin. They pick it up, carry it back to the colony, and feed it to the queen. These are fairly efficient and easy to apply, and there's a very small amount of insecticide or growth regulator that is used. The thing that most people like is these products are low cost. The active ingredient is carried to the mound by the ants, so you leave little to no residue on the schoolyard once the product has been applied. So what is a fire ant bait? Dawn mentioned baits a little earlier. With fire ants, the first thing you have is you have a carrier. This is usually a defatted corn cob, ground corn cob for fire ant mounds. It serves as a means of distributing both the attractant and the active ingredient. The attractant is usually a vegetable oil of some type. Soybean oil is the one mainly used. It serves as both an attractant for the fire ant. Don't mention that specific ants have specific things that they like to eat, and fire ants are attracted to oils. The third thing you need is an active ingredient. This is the actual insecticide that affects the ants, and it may be a metabolic inhibitor or it may be an insect growth regulator. You put all of this together, you get a bait. Hopefully you'll see the little ants picking the bait up and carrying it back to the mound. You need to be careful with fire ant baits because it does have an oil in there, and these can become stale or rancid, so you only need to buy the product that you want to use for the current season and to make sure it's fresh when you put it out for the fire ants. The other thing to be careful of is when you're buying product, is to make sure that the product label says fire ant bait. A lot of my stakeholders here confuse insecticide granular baits, granular insecticides with fire ant baits. They look very similar, as you can see here from the picture, and you want to make sure that the product you get does say fire ant bait on the label. One of the types I mentioned were the metabolic or nervous system inhibitors. These products actually kill the workers, and most of the products listed here usually will take a minimum of 2 weeks to work. Since they kill the workers, they have to be put on at sublethal levels, fed through the 4th instar larvae, and it takes a while to distribute this toxin at enough levels to start killing the queen and the mound. There are a couple of products on the market that will do work faster. These are probates. They are not toxic until they are metabolized, and so they can be carried back to the mound in heavier loads, and they kill at a faster rate, from 2 to 5 days to 3 to 14 days. The second classification of baits that we have are insect growth regulators. These do not kill the workers. Um, these usually act to prevent the larval stages from developing, and they cause the queen to lay sterile eggs. So the workers have to die of old age. And if you remember, I mentioned, depending on the size, the workers can live from up to 60 to 150 days. So it takes a little while for the rest of the mound to die off from natural causes. So the growth regulators take a little longer to work. There are a couple of products on the market also that are product mixtures. And these, again, like the metabolic inhibitor itself, will take 2 to 4 weeks to work. But the thing with all of these is they have extended control, which is, we call it bioresidual. So what is a bioresidual? I mentioned it earlier. This is the killing power of that bait. It includes a technology that actually kills the ant workers. And if you look at insect growth regulators, we really don't have anything that kills the workers in there, but plus the associated natural biological mortality. And this I mentioned earlier when I said that most of our fire ants here in the South are territorial. They will kill other ants that come into the territory, and if new queens land there, they kill those new queens as they're dying off slowly. So fire ants actually prevent new fire ant infestations as they die off slowly. The best way to apply bait is to broadcast the bait. You can use small handheld seeders like this one. Or if you want to apply baits over a large area, there are only 2 pieces of equipment that I know that you can use to apply bait and do it efficiently and put it out at the correct rate. The one is a Herd GT77 fire ant bait spreader. It has specialized plates you can see in the upper left-hand corner that has different size holes in them. And there are calibration tables you can get with the Herd seeder that actually tell you which bait to use, which plate to use, and how fast to drive your piece of equipment. These can be obtained for about $500. The other piece of equipment is a Bicom seeder. It also has to have a clover plate attachment that goes along with it, and it is a very expensive seeder at about $3,000. So, but these are the only 2 pieces of equipment, if you're applying fire ant bait and want it to put out correctly, that you can put it out at the 1.5 pounds per acre that the fire ant bait is recommended to put out. If you use any other type of seeder or spreader at all, you're going to put the fire ant bait out at rates that are too high and are above label rates. Bait application is a little bit tricky. You need to apply it at temperatures between 70 and 85 degrees. The applications need to be made during the hot days of the summer. When you do it thin, you need to put it out in the early morning or the late afternoon to make sure that the ground is cool enough for the ants to be able to go out and pick up the bait. You don't want rain expected within 12 hours or so. It is basically corncob grit carrier, and it will get mushy if it gets wet. You want to store your baits in a cool, dry place, and don't store them with pesticides, gasoline, or other volatile chemicals because it can pick up odors from this, and it will make the bait less attractive for the ants. And only buy what you're going to use each year. Remember, I said the baits can go rancid because it does have a vegetable oil in there. Only broadcast during the warmer months. The rule of thumb I use here in Alabama and Florida and Texas, where we have more southern areas, it will be a little different, but basically I use from tax day until about October 15th as the time of the year that fire ant baits can be effective. You can do the individual mound treatments any time during the year, but only warmer days during the winter months. And you can use those faster acting fire ant baits if the fire ant mound is not in a place where it's going, someone is going to get in it immediately. And if you're spreading fertilizer over the schoolyard or on the athletic fields, you can mix the fire ant bait with the fertilizer if you do the application just after the product is mixed together. So why are baits used more? Well, most people want immediate control. They want it yesterday. Most people don't understand how they work, which is why I usually talk about fire ant biology when I discuss using fire ant baits. A lot of people confuse these with granular insecticides. Again, you need to read the label, make sure that it says fire ant bait on the label. They're difficult to apply at the label rates if you don't have the proper equipment, and the application timing can be inconvenient. A lot of school people don't want to work from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until dark during the heat of the summer months in July and August when you need to put out the fire ant baits when it's cooler in the afternoon. So why should you use baits? These are the safest products on the market for fire ants. They have a very low amount of active ingredient in the product. You let the fire ants do the work for you. They will pick up the bait and carry it back to the mound. So you use the natural behavior of the ants to distribute the toxicant to the colony. You kill the queen in addition to the workers. Dawn mentioned this earlier. If you take out the queen, you're going to take out the mound. Fire ant baits are relatively inexpensive. They leave relatively no residual product in the schoolyard, and the slow kill results in slower reinfestation in the schoolyard. And we'll take questions at the end, so I'll turn it over to Dan.
Well, thank you, Dr. Graham, for your informative fire ant instruction. Next up is Dr. Dan Suter, who will discuss biology, behavior, management, and control of carpenter ants. Dan, it's all yours.
All right, well, thank you, Marcia, and welcome everybody, wherever you might be this afternoon. So we are going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Camponotus species, Camponotus pennsylvanicus, which is the black carpenter ant, which is the most common carpenter ant species in the eastern half of the United States. It's from Canada all the way down to here in Georgia. We do quite a bit of work at nighttime. You'll find out in a few minutes when we talk about carpenter ant biology. This is a nocturnal ant. Feeds mostly at night times, most active at night. There are a couple species out on the west coast, Camponotus modoc and Camponotus bicinus, which are the major pests out out west. And the colonies are much bigger out there, but the biology is pretty much the same. Camponotus is a huge group of ants, but we have really just a handful of species that you might consider a pest species. So here's our creature that we're going to talk about here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some really important aspects of carpenter ant biology, and this really does dovetail quite nicely with the comments from Dr. Gouge and Graham on inspection and baiting. So, with carpenter ants, I've been working with carpenter ants for a long time and seen some major changes in how things are done on controlling carpenter ants, but we have some really good carpenter ant baits that are available today. And so, back 15 years ago, we didn't have very many good baits, and pest control operators and homeowners were had to resort to spraying for carpenter ants around structures. And as you'll see when we talk about the biology here in just a minute, there really is no need to spray for carpenter ants anymore. If you do a proper inspection and you find out where the carpenter ants are foraging from and to, and that is critically important because they typically forage from point A to point B, and they'll do that all summer long. If you can find that and provide a little bit of bait to the ants, you can take them out. You can take out a carpenter ant colony with the amount of bait that would fit on a quarter. And it's pretty commonly done these days with the quality of the carpenter ant baits that are available. So here's the black carpenter ant. So the ant chews wood, right? See if I can get the pointer to work here. So carpenter ants chew wood, but they don't eat it, right? So this is a major difference between typical wood-infesting insects or wood-destroying insects like beetles and especially termites. Carpenter ants, they're a major nuisance because they actually get in and will chew wood. Since they're not eating it, one of the byproducts of chewing that wood and making a nest site in the area that they're living is they dump out sawdust. So you'll see evidence of carpenter ants where they might be living as sawdust at the base of trees and things like that. Their primary nest site on the outside they nest in trees, and they will forage from that tree over into structures from time to time, and that's when they become a pest. They can set up shop as secondary nest sites in structures and create pest problems there. It's a big black visible ant, so it's not a tiny little thing that you're going to run into. It's a big black ant that can cause problems when they're seen on the inside. And we'll show that they are active at nighttime. So the work that we did, I did some work at Purdue years ago, and we continue some of that work here at Georgia. The number of ants that you might see during the daytime would be of very small fraction of what you're going to see at nighttime. And in the summertime, when they're most active, July, August, June, that time of year, you may see a few ants on the outside of a tree kind of foraging up and down the outside of a tree, but you go out there at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at nighttime and you'll see hundreds of carpenter ants foraging up and down that tree. And then we'll talk a little bit about their control. You need to find the colony or the most likely site of the colony and provide them a gel or granular bait. And as you'll see here in just a second, based on their biology, really is critical to find out, to do a proper inspection and to find out where the ants are coming from, because you miss it by just a foot, you'll fail to control the colony of ants. So they do cause damage. They are wood-destroying organisms. They get in and they chew the wood. You can see the typical damage that carpenter ants will cause here. They'll get in and chew the wood, and that's where they set up shop and they put their brood and their eggs, and the queen will be living in an area like this. So that could be in a structure somewhere, and they might have a tree on the outside 10 or 15 feet away from the structure, 100 feet away from the structure where the primary colony might be, and they might set up a secondary shop inside the structure. A lot of times it is associated with a little bit of moisture damage because the ants are, of course, critical component of their life is moisture. So the sawdust, talked about the sawdust. So this is at the base of a tree, and in the springtime, when the ants start their spring cleaning, and carpenter ants in the more northern climates and as far south here as Georgia will undergo what we call diapause, and it's basically a hibernating ant. They go to sleep. It's a chemically induced sleep. They go to sleep during the wintertime. If you've ever wondered why or how carpenter ants survive in extreme cold temperatures as far north as Canada, they go into a physiological change called diapause, and that allows them to survive the winter. So when they get up and they wake up in the springtime, the days start warming up, they get active and they start their spring cleaning and they start expanding the nest size, and you'll see piles of sawdust like this where that's evidence of a carpenter ant, an active carpenter ant colony. Any tree on your property or your school property or even at your home will have a tree like this, right? So any type of deficiency in a tree like this, or it could be something which is as small a hole as you see right here at the end of this arrow, the yellow arrow, could potentially house a carpenter ant colony. So with the hole right here, you don't know what's going on in the tree back here, right? So, but that is suggestive of a deficiency that might go all the way up into the tree, and carpenter ants will find that. A queen carpenter ant will find that and set up a nest in there, and you won't see ants here during the daytime. You go back to this same tree at nighttime, and you'll see dozens, if not hundreds, of carpenter ants filing out of this hole en route to another place over here where they might be foraging, which would typically be another tree. So here's just the damage that you see right here was actually caused by carpenter ants, right? So here's a branch that was cut off by a tree surgeon, and you can see the damage here that was caused by carpenter ants. The ants you see out here are the result of a baiting that I did, and then the ants they leave the nest and they start meandering around the tree. But you can see there's a potential queen right there. There's a winged queen, and then you see workers out here that are moving around. And so if you could picture this branch being attached to the tree, there was a tremendous amount of damage that was in that tree, and there was an active colony in that tree. Carpenter ants produce these permanent trails. So, and this gets back to the importance of proper inspection. I think everybody can see this trail, correct? So you see the trail right here, right? And so if I advance the slide, see the black line? So what those ants were doing, the ants were actually living in this tree. I watched this colony for several years. These are long-lived colonies. The queens, as Dawn pointed out, can live a very long time. These ants are active here in Georgia starting about now. They'll be active through about September. This particular colony was living in this tree, foraging over into this tree, and as Dawn also pointed out, the ants were going up and feeding on honeydew that was produced by aphids and scale insects on the new plant growth in the canopy of this second tree. So they collect the honeydew, it's almost pure sugar, and they bring that back to the colony. During the daytime, you won't see any ants on this trail. You go out at nighttime, and there's herds of ants following this trail right here. The cool thing about this is you have to, when it comes to inspection, you have to find out where the ants are coming from, this tree, and where they're going over here. The amount of bait that would fit on a quarter would take out this colony, but the problem is if you put the bait here or you put the bait over here, they'll never find it because they don't forage like many other ant species. Carpenter ants forage from point A here to point B over here. If you put the bait right underneath their nose, there are numerous baits, we'll talk about that in just a second, that will take that colony out. There's several baits that are really good carpenter ant baits that can be utilized today. And but you've got to do a proper inspection. You've got to find out where they're coming from. So just another example here of this was in Indiana several years ago. So I don't know why, but the ants were living in this tree, foraging all the way over here, 120 feet away to another tree over here. And you can see the flags that we put out at nighttime as we were watching the carpenter ants forage from this tree all the way over to this tree. So here's a consider any hardwood tree that might be within 100 to 200 feet of a school building. You need to look at this. If you got potentially carpenter ants in a structure somewhere that might be a school building, the maintenance people probably need to be looking at hardwood trees on the outside of those buildings and inspecting those trees for carpenter ants. Here's another example. This was here on the UGA campus in Athens. We had a colony that was living in this knothole right up here. And the yellow line delineates what their foraging path was. They were foraging down the tree, on the ground over here, up the wall. And they did this every night. I watched this colony for several years, all the way over here to the tree. Since they're trail followers, they went along this edge right here, and they would forage down to a garbage can that was down here, and that was probably 100 feet. So again, inspection. This was in Indiana. We got a complaint from a lady who was having problems with carpenter ants in her kitchen, which was over here. Big black ants were coming out in her kitchen. Every single night she would have, she'd kill several ants in her kitchen. And so we went out there to visit her, and we found it's hard to see in this photo right here, but there's a tree right here. And what we did, I had a graduate student at the time that was working on mark recapture and looking at movement patterns of carpenter ants, and he was painting them different colors. So what you did was the way he would paint them is he would get some crickets and he would squash up the crickets and put them on a petri dish top, put them down at the base of the tree on the ground down here, and then when carpenter ants start feeding on something, it almost takes a bomb to scare them away. So what you've got to, you just put a little dot of paint on them, and what happened was when we did that, he painted 15 carpenter ants one night. The next night she killed 8 of those painted carpenter ants in her kitchen. So what we found was that the carpenter ants were moving from this tree along this trail right here. They didn't deviate from that trail, and it was through the grass. If you could pull the grass apart, it looked like it was a very well manicured trail underneath the grass. So what we had to do was go out there at dusk, find out where the ants were moving, which direction they were moving, and if you stare at a particular point, you can see ants moving through the grass. You pull the grass back, and you can find the ants moving from point A to point B, and then you do that in a couple different areas. You just line them up, and you've got a pretty good idea where the ants are moving. Over here, they were going up through the rigid board insulation, following some conduit, and coming out in her kitchen and feeding in her kitchen at a dishwasher. There's lots of food in the dishwasher and lots of water in the dishwasher, and that's where they were foraging. So I said this a bit ago, but years ago, the pest control industry, what they would have done is gone and done a perimeter pyrethroid treatment around this structure. So you might have treated 2 or 3 feet high and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 feet away from the structure, not taking into consideration the biology of this creature. So the amount of bait that would fit on a quarter placed right here at the base of this tree took out this colony. And with probably micrograms of active ingredient at 0.001%, you can take out an entire colony here and stop a problem that might be happening in this structure. They are active at nighttime. This is had a student at Purdue that was working on, he had put a little sensor over some carpenter ant trails at nighttime. And those sensors went back to a data logger, and he could put that sensor over a carpenter ant trail and count the number of carpenter ants every hour, and he did this for a week. So he put out a sensor over a trail, and every hour for a week, it sent a total number of carpenter ants that were counted by that sensor back to the data logger. So this was one July day. So it goes from 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You see 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. There's nothing going on here. This is number of carpenter ants counted over here on the y-axis. There's 100. So look what happens here. At 7 p.m., you start seeing an uptick. From 7 p.m. to 8 p.m., you're counting maybe 5 carpenter ants. Look what happens at 8 o'clock. There's 200 carpenter ants counted per hour. By 9 o'clock, it's 350 carpenter ants. And the black line that you see here is light intensity. So as the light intensity goes down, the number of carpenter ants goes up. He did this for 5 or 6 colonies, and the pattern was always the same. And in the middle of the night, look at the number of ants he's counting per hour. It's 400 to 500 ants per hour that are counted by that sensor. In the next morning, as the sun comes up, the light intensity goes up. They're kind of like vampires, right? So they return to their nest site, and look what's happening during the middle of the day. You're just not seeing any ants counted by that sensor. So keep in mind, that's when we're doing our inspections. And so it probably would help to be out there at nighttime. I know you can't do that a lot of times, but if you find a few carpenter ants on a tree, there's probably a pretty good chance that maybe you've got them in that tree. And then if you can find a trail or kind of see that visible trail, that cattle path trail that I showed you a bit ago, that would help you kind of determine where they might be nesting. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about baiting. I'm not even going to talk about spraying because there really is no need to spray for carpenter ants anymore, but we have such good baits available. So you want to deliver baits. Mostly gel baits. We have some really good gel baits. We don't have very many real good granular baits for carpenter ants. There is one called Advanced Carpenter Ant granules that are pretty good. That's basically one of the few carpenter ant granular baits that we have out there that work very well. But you want to put it right on the trails, as we said. So this is a depiction of maybe a structure right here. Maybe you've got them coming out right here, and these are my hardwood trees, and these are trails between those hardwood trees. So you might have a carpenter ant over here, trail where they're trailing between those trees and not harming anything, but you might have a tree right here where there's a carpenter ant colony, and maybe they're foraging over into the structure. And maybe they're foraging in between a couple trees over here as well. So again, you put the bait over here, or you put the bait over here, and they're not going to find it. You've got to do an inspection. You've got to find out where they are on that trail, put the bait right underneath their nose. And if you can do that with an inspection, you have a pretty good chance of getting rid of the colony. So just some pictures here of some of the baits that we've tried in the past. These are professional baits. There's a really good over-the-counter bait called Combat Ant Killing Gel that works really well. It's equivalent to one of the baits I'm going to show you here in just a second with 0.001% fipronil. This is Advion Ant Bait Gel by Syngenta. It's indoxacarb is the active ingredient. You see they like it pretty well. And what they'll do is with some of these gel baits, the ants will actually bite off pieces of this, and you can see them taking it back up into the colony. And they'll take that, like this ant right here. It looks like she's picking up a blob of that bait and is going to take it back up into the colony. This is OptiGuard, another bait. I think this is I can't remember who has this bait. But it's a 0.01% thiamethoxam, and they like it pretty well. They like it pretty good as well. And it's a little bit drier bait. It kind of stands up a little bit better. And you can see there's not very much bait there, but you put out a couple caps of this right next. This is the tree right here. Put it right out next to where the ants are foraging. They find it, they chew it up, and they'll take big globs of that back up into the colony and feed it to their brood. The borate baits have never worked very well for us. They just don't. What we typically do is we'll bait a colony, and then we'll go back a year later and see how well that colony is doing. And invariably, when we use OptiGuard or Advion or Max Force gel or any of those, the ants are gone a year later. With the borate baits, they're always back. So we just don't get that strong response that we do with some of these other baits. And you go back a year later, and the colonies are still active. Our standard bait that we compare everything against, and I've done this for more than 10 years, the one that I think probably is the best is Max Force Carpenter Ant Bait Gel. It's 0.001% fipronil. See how they respond to it quite well. There is an equivalent over-the-counter bait called Combat Ant Killing Gel. It's basically the same bait. And we've done some work with it as well, and they respond really well to it. And so you can see, they're getting down there and kind of rooting in like pigs, and they get in there and chew on the bait, and they suck up some of the liquid, and they take that back up to the colony, and does a pretty good job on the carpenter ant. So again, you can see them how they're responding here. And here, just an example here, big colony in this tree right here. Put the bait right down here because we knew the colony was right over here. Had we put the bait right over here, they never would have found it. And so a couple days after we baited, the tree cavity was filled with a couple thousand dead and dying carpenter ants. So again, just to reiterate here, don't need to pile on, so to speak here, but really deliver your baits from piles after a thorough inspection of where you might find the carpenter ants nesting and find their foraging trails. So I just leave you with this: given the quality of today's carpenter ant baits, you can eliminate a carpenter ant colony. Couldn't say that years ago, but with the proper inspection, proper application of the proper bait, you can basically eliminate a carpenter ant colony. So I'm happy to chat with anybody at any time. Just here's my contact information, email address, phone number, and feel free to call me at any time. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Suter, for your guidance on inspection and control of carpenter ants. That was very informative. Lastly, Mr. Fred Remulus will discuss practical ant control challenges in the Upper Merion School District in Pennsylvania. Fred, it's all yours.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Fred Remulus. I'm the Director of Operations at the Upper Merion Area School District. We're outside of Philadelphia, and our claim to fame is the Valley Forge National Park and the King of Prussia Mall, which is the largest mall in the country. And so I just want to start by emphasizing that ants are not terrorizing in most schools. Unlike this ant where he's stuck his mandibles into someone's finger, as a general rule, ants are not something that you have to really freak out about when someone calls you about ants. Please, do not get swayed by all of the advertisements for the use of pesticides. This particular store shelf had 17 different kinds of poisons and pesticides to kill ants, and we need to be really, really reasonable about how we treat for ants in public schools. So I want to remind my fellow facilities managers and school principals and nurses and so forth that you need to get real when it comes to the treatment of ants. You're in charge, and you need to apply a rational and reasonable approach in how to control ants. And the previous three speakers gave you a lot of good pointers to follow for specialty ants like carpenters and fire ants, and also just general common ants that wander into your school buildings. Be prepared, and again, be responsible in how you treat for ants. Pictured up on the right here is our entire arsenal of items that we use to control pests at the Upper Merion Area School District. The electronic controls work real well for mice and roaches and so forth, and they basically go away. Occasionally we'll need a snap trap to deal with a mouse, and then these are the two items that we use, and there are other products available as well to combat ants. And we use the gels and the bait. But I'm going to say this several times, and this is the phrase I use very commonly when people call me about ants and other pests, and that's, if you feed them, they will come. this really needs to be the focus of your integrated pest management strategy. The pictures on the left are a section of our middle school, and we found ants on the 3rd floor of our middle school. They had climbed all the way up the side and had gotten into one of our classrooms. This is the equivalent of you finding a slice of pizza on the top of the Four Seasons Hotel in Miami. Ants are really, really good at finding food. So again, if you feed them, they will come. This is a brochure that we got from a national pest control company that sent us their brochure via email. And again, item number 2 in how the 6 steps to have a pest-free office is don't feed the ants. If you do, they will come. Just a reminder, again, what we think to be a very tiny, small quantity of food for ants, you know, the one potato chip that we can't resist, that will feed hundreds and hundreds of ants. So it's really important that you work closely with your custodial department to clean up messes very quickly after students or office occupants are gone, and that you work with teachers and staff and students about cleaning up their messes immediately to not feed pests. We very, very rarely have an infestation of ants, and this is our boathouse down on the Schuylkill River. This is the only infestation of ants that I've had here in probably the last 5 or 6 years. And for some reason, a bunch of ants came into the boathouse, and our response was to inspect the building, try and figure out what kind of ant it was. We called our exterminator, and then we had to decide what kind of options we were going to use. In this particular case, they felt they had to spray the building for it. And under Integrated Pest Management regulations in Pennsylvania, we had to put a notice on the door saying that we were going to treat and we were going to use pesticides and so forth. And from our perspective, that's not good public relations when you have to start posting notices on the doors for the public, especially parents, to see because they get really concerned and hyper about the use of pesticides in buildings. So we really try to avoid this kind of application and issues. But this, as a general rule in schools, this has been extremely rare. The more typical problem, again, is that we'll get an email that says we have ants in our stockroom. And our response will be to go and inspect the area, to identify the ants again, determine what we're going to use, but we try to use our baits and our gels that I showed earlier so that we don't have to post notices to our parents and the public that we're using pesticides. And it is extremely rare that we use pesticides inside of our school buildings for ants. That almost never happens. Again, just to keep repeating the same phrase over and over again, if you feed them, the ants will come. It's just very much that simple. I strongly encourage you to work very closely with your custodians, your teachers, office staff, whomever, to minimize the amount of food that you leave laying around for ants. The previous speaker spoke about ants and how they find it. Here's another reminder of that. They send out ants to forage for food, and when they find it, they leave a trail back, and the other ants follow that trail until they find the food and bring it back to the nest. So as facilities people and nurses and school principals, we need to think like an ant. So how do you outsmart an ant? It's just really easy. Don't feed them. That's the primary rule. Don't feed the ants. Clean up your messes afterwards. Work hard with custodians and teachers. Make sure that everything is put away in sealable containers that the ants can't get to. Clean them. One of the basic things that we've found is that a general purpose cleaner or something like a window cleaner, in this case Whistle or Windex or any kind of general purpose cleaner, it typically kills the ants when you spray them on direct contact. Equally important, when you're cleaning up, it removes the trail that was laid down to the food. And if the other ants can't find the trail, they go back home or they go somewhere else to find their ants. And by using a general purpose cleaner, you clean up the residue from soda spills or candy or whatever it was that the ants were looking for. So what do we learn about ants? Again, I'm going to say it again. If you feed them, they will come. And you need to be smarter than an ant. And remember not to feed them. I constantly reinforce this with anyone who calls me and says, I have an ant problem, or even when I have a roach problem or a mice problem. If you feed them, they will come. And again, remind your custodians that they need to clean up areas where food is served immediately after students leave or the office occupants leave the building, so that we're not leaving food laying around for the ants to find. And they should be cleaning those areas where they know food is served when they first come on at night, and then do the other cleaning in the building where there's not food present later on in the evening, so that the ants and other pests don't have an opportunity to find them. And then again, just to relax as facilities managers, building owners, office occupants, when people start to call you about pest control problems, ant problems, even though the urge might be there to go and react and overreact, step back, relax, think like an ant, think like a mouse, think like a roach, and take the steps that you need to follow so that you're following integrated pest management procedures and you're not excessively using pesticides inside of buildings where students are present. Most importantly, where very young students are present, kindergarten, first grade, because those children are extremely susceptible to pesticides and so forth. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Fred, for wrapping up the presentation portion of our webinar. Just a few quick announcements. Here is the remaining upcoming webinar for this school year, termite mitigation. It airs at 2 p.m. Eastern. We hope you can join us, so save the date. And for more information or to sign up, visit our website. As an attendee of today's webinar, you can download a certificate of attendance. And for some of you, these certificates will provide supportive documentation for continuing education credits. You'll be sent a link in a few hours after the webinar to print your own certificate. The School IPM Listserv is our way to assist and motivate those in the school community to start, grow, and sustain their IPM programs. By subscribing, you'll receive invitations to upcoming webinars, highlights from and links to IPM-related newsletters, updates on EPA's school IPM activities, along with other pertinent announcements. So to sign up for our listserv, go to our website, or you can email us at theschool.ipm@epa.gov. And again, thank you to our great presenters, Dr. Dawn Goose, Dr. Lawrence Spud Graham, Dr. Daniel Suter, and Mr. Fred Remulus, and to each and every one of you, our audience, for participating in this webinar. In time after the webinar is concluded, a list of all questions and answers will be provided on our website, along with a set of resources, links, the PDF of the PowerPoint slides, and the recorded presentation will also be located on the same web page. Following are a short series of questions designed for us to serve you better. Please help us to help you and others by answering these short questions. Then we will entertain your questions. We're going to begin questions that you posed during the webinar in the question pod. Please feel free to add any other questions to the pod now. and any questions that are not answered will eventually be placed on our webpage. So I'm going to start with the questions. For Dawn, are ants emitters of any substance that affect indoor air quality? And if so, will this content trigger asthma in children?
Gosh, that's a good question, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that. Many insects can cause allergens that can contribute to problems for students. I'm not aware of any ant issues, and I will defer to the three chaps also on the call and ask if they're aware of anything. But I'm not immediately aware of anything. For sure, the venomous stings can trigger allergic reactions, but as far as indoor air quality is concerned, I'm not aware of any concerns. Gentlemen?
Yeah, this is Spud. I don't know of any like that.
Yeah, this is Dan.
Dan?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not aware of anything of that sort. You'd probably be more concerned with the venomous stings of things like fire ants and Asian needle ants, things of that sort. But I'm not aware of anything that might alter indoor air quality that might come from an ant.
Well, thank you, and no news is always good news. Dan, how big are carpenter ants, and are they all the same size?
Yeah, so I think I didn't point this out, but carpenter ants are typically, and Fudd was mentioning this, they're what we call polymorphic, poly meaning many and morphic meaning size. So a small worker carpenter ant might be 1/4 of an inch. A large worker might be 1/2 inch long. So they're black and they're polymorphic and 1/4 to 1/2 inch long.
Okay, Dawn, one for you. Can you reliably identify ants from a smell?
Oh, yes. Well, I should say, let me qualify that. There are odorous house ants that you can crush, and they smell, to me, they smell very much like a pina colada. They have like a delicious coconut smell. And so that is the one ant that I am personally able to identify. And so I'll see these ants sometimes, and they'll be trailing outside. And from their behavior and their general appearance, I think, oh, I'm fairly certain that's an odorous house ant. So I will crush them with my fingertips and sniff my hands. And people look at you very oddly when you're doing that. But lo and behold, I get a nice shot to the brain of, oh, I'm on a beach drinking a pina colada, and just for a moment there. But other than that, some people can identify other kind of citrusy kind of smells from various ants, but that's the only one that's reliable for me.
Thank you, Dawn. Wow, I'm going to have to find those ants. For Fudd, do fire ants pose any threat to students other than a painful sting?
Well, yes. There are some students that are highly allergic to this. In fact, in Corpus Christi, Texas, 2 years ago, there was a football player that knelt down in a mound during a game, and he actually got stung so many times he went into anaphylactic shock, and he passed away 2 days later. So that is one of the reasons we like to keep fire ants off of the field. But the thing about fire ants, too, is you don't usually get one sting. They usually sting in multiples if you get in the mound.
Okay.
But other than that, and they will come inside, too, going for food and looking for food. Sometimes they build their nest up close to the building, and as he said a while ago, if you leave out food, if you feed them, they will come, too, and come inside. But most of the time, they're a problem in the schoolyard or the athletic facilities as opposed to being inside the building.
Thank you, Fudd. I have one more for you here. How far can winged fire ants disperse?
We actually had a guy here that did a study on that, and he did some flight times with the fire ants, and under their own power, they could go up to about 3 or 4 miles. but they were pretty spent when they got there at that point in time. But if they get up in the air, and they do mate, I didn't mention this, at several hundred feet up in the air, if they get caught in wind currents, they can go several miles down the road with no problem. So what that entails is, even though you do a good job in your schoolyard of keeping the ants out, if you have pastures down the road or homeowners down the road or just roadsides down the road that have fire ant populations and they come out and mate, you can end up getting reinfested very quickly with no problem at all.
Okay, here's one, perhaps for Dawn or Fred. What is good for those little ants that you find in houses? How do you control them?
I think I'm going to say it depends which little ants we're talking about. I'd be guessing if I have little teeny tiny ants in my home that are associated with sink areas primarily, and those are little rove ants. But so I kind of know what I would do for those particular ants. But again, it really depends which species of ant, and I'll ask Fred and the other gentlemen if they have any tips regarding where they could send some ants for identification and a good answer on that.
I just looked at the question again, and it prefaces that the attendee is from Kentucky.
Marcia, this is Dan. I suspect that would be something called a dark rover ant that Dawn had just mentioned. That rover ant is a tiny little monomorphic this time, so it's all the workers are the same size, and they are very tiny. They're probably a 1/16 of an inch long. It's an invasive that came into Louisiana back in the late 1970s and has spread throughout most of the southeast. Just a couple of years ago, we didn't have it here in Georgia, but it's all over Atlanta now. It's moving north. I suspect it probably is in the Kentucky area by now. Could also be an odorous house ant that Dawn had mentioned. It has that real peculiar smell to it. I think it smells like suntan lotion, so it's right up there with the pina colada. But could be that. I don't think Argentine ants make it that far north. A good general control strategy for ants like that are some of the gel baits, that combat ant killing gel that you can get over the counter, or some of the combat bait stations work fairly well. But if you can, a lot of times these ants are nesting on the outside and they're foraging to the inside. So if you do a good job of tracing them to the outside, sometimes you can just physically remove the colony and not have to do a lot on the inside. There's no need ever to spray anything, raid anything of that sort on the inside for ants. Baits are really the way to go. So put away the raid can, any spray. There's really no need to do any of that. You really can make the problem worse. And try to find the colony on the outside.
Okay, due to time, we're just going to be able to do one more question. Fudd, there's a question about how did imported fire ants get into the U.S., and how long have they been in the U.S.?
Well, actually, there are two species of the imported fire ant that are here. There's the red imported fire ant, or Solenopsis invicta, and the black imported fire ant, or Solenopsis richteri. The Solenopsis richteri came into Porter-Mobile around 1918, and the red imported fire ant came in again through the Porter-Mobile, Alabama's famous once again, between 1930 and 1940. And basically, we think they came in from ships that were carrying goods down to South America. They either brought back fruits or had ballast in the bottom of the ship. When they came back, it was emptied out at the Porter-Mobile, and the fire ants came with them.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to all of our presenters for answering such great and sometimes challenging questions. This concludes our webinar on ants, the #1 pest in schools. Thanks again for attending, and we hope that you tune in next month for our next school IPM webinar on termites. Goodbye, and thank you.